director of the very same library, Dave Schroeder. Dave's been the executive director since 2006 or 7. When he vacated his position is when I stepped up, and let me tell you, I'm still filling big shoes. He's responsible for the greatness of our local history collection. Just go saying thank you and be okay. It's true. But he also spent time working as the archivist for the Covington Diocese. And so what he's going to talk about today are the orphanages in Kenton and Campbell counties. And with that, I present Dave Schroeder.
My little story, if we're going to tell jokes, since Dr. Tencuddy told a joke, I'll tell a joke. When they hired me to be director of the library, they called me in after they had done 3 days of interviews with each candidate, and it was a national search, so I felt very fortunate. But when I got called in, I wasn't sure, what the answer was, and they told me that I was going to be the next executive director, which I was very pleased about. And they said, your first day is April 1st. Really? So actually, April 1st will be my 10th anniversary as director, and I have been at the library for 27 years. Most of that time I actually spent in local history and genealogy. So I tell people there are days when I'm working in my office and I want to say I want to go back. But unfortunately, Elaine is there and she's doing a wonderful job, so I have to stay where I am and do it. So I do love my job though, and I'm glad that I'm able to do these things now and then to keep in touch with the local history stuff and what's going on in the local history community, because it's my first true love. So today we're going to talk about orphanages in Northern Kentucky, and there's some common themes, and I know some of you probably have questions about records, so I'll try to touch on that as I go along, but if you have questions at the end, I'll try to leave some time at the end that you can ask questions as well. So, the first orphanage that we know of that was established specifically as an orphanage was in North America was in 1729 in Natchez, Mississippi by Ursuline sisters, Ursuline nuns. And we'll see a theme throughout this program. Religious groups had a huge role in orphanages and how they developed, either Protestant or Catholic. And women in particular played a significant role in orphanages and how they operated and how they flourished and evolved over the years. Mostly in the 18th and 19th century, orphans went to neighbors or to city almshouses. So it's not unusual if you've done your genealogy where you find a true orphanage. An orphan ends up in an uncle's house or an aunt's house or a cousin's house or a godparent's house. So that's what's really happening. Not until really we see the expansion of urban areas, large urban areas, do we see what we would consider an orphanage become fairly common. So in Northern Kentucky, the first known orphanage or movement actually to deal with orphans in an organized fashion happens in 1848 in Covington, where the German Catholics of Covington met. They were actually parishioners of Mother of God Parish, so tied in with our opening talk this morning. And they decided that there were a number of German orphans in the area and they needed to be taken care of. What's happening in the late 1840s, by the way, in Northern Kentucky and throughout the Midwest that would maybe lead to orphans?
Population increase in cholera.
Cholera, we have cholera epidemic, so we're seeing parents dying. We are also seeing population booms and industrial accidents and all of those kinds of things. Now, when we talk about orphans throughout this session, we're going to be talking about people who truly were orphans, who had lost both parents. We're going to be talking about children who had lost one parent and the other parent, for one reason or another, was not capable of caring for them. So orphans has a more, not the specific term of losing both parents. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. So we'll talk about how that change has allowed orphanages to evolve as well. The St. John Orphan Society started with a balance of $62.56 in 1848. And what they decided to do at that time was to, if there were true orphans or children whose parents could not care for them, they would put them in another home. So they would find a parishioner who could take in those children. Fortunately for those children, they tried to keep them together, but if they couldn't, sometimes they were split up and they were sent to other families living in the community. In 1868, the St. John's Orphan Society bought a building in what is today Fort Mitchell, on what is today Orphanage Road. So Orphanage Road is named because the orphanage was on it. So 1871, the new St. John Orphanage is established. If you look at that map, it is, and then boy, that's really fuzzy. It's marked on there. I'm trying to see. I don't think I have a pointer on here. Maybe I do. If I do, it doesn't work. Anyway, does it work?
Yes.
Yes, it works there. Why doesn't it? Oh, here we go. There we are. St. John's Orphan Asylum, it says. This is the current day Orphanage Road leading down to the 3L, and this would be up here, Dixie Highway. So the Benedictine sisters actually owned a farm down here called Subico. They named it Subico, or the previous owners owned it. The diocese had property up here that had been used as an orphanage. St. Aloysius Orphanage, during the Civil War, it shut down and the diocese had no need for it, and so St. John purchased the property and turned it into the first St. John's Orphanage. And the Benedictine sisters, who at that time were in Covington, they were not on their property at that time in Villa Hills, they were still in downtown Covington on 12th Street, decided that they would take on the task of caring for the orphans. This is the original building. Built in, the original building actually was a house. This was the first original building built by the society. It was built in 1876. The chapel was used by area residents and became known as St. John Congregation. So for many years, if you look in records of the diocese, you will see a St. John Congregation, Fort Mitchell, or Kenton County, it always says, it doesn't say Fort Mitchell. So if you're looking for that congregation, it is really the orphanage. It's the orphanage chapel. The orphans, I thought this was very interesting. There was a school on the property, and the orphans and the children of the community were taught in the same classrooms by the same sisters. So there didn't seem to be an issue with the orphans being taught with the children of the community, which I thought was somewhat interesting for this time period. The orphanage was also a working farm, so the sisters had hired men to help oversee the operations. The sisters and the children also helped out on the farm, so if you talk to some of the orphans who grew up at St. John Orphanage, they will talk about that they had light farm duty, they helped plant the crops, they helped bring them in on occasion, they helped take care of the animals. Some of it was therapeutic, and some of it was they needed the food to survive. During this time period, you have to remember, this is all a private charitable organization. There's no government money. So this is all being run by donations through the churches of Northern Kentucky, through the Catholic churches in Northern Kentucky, pulling their resources. And there was an annual orphan collection done in the diocese, at every church in the diocese, and that money was split between 2 orphan asylums, St. John being one of them. So the sisters had to be very resourceful and talk in their records consistently about turning down food maybe a couple of days to make sure that the children ate. So, they were constantly struggling to keep up with the growing number of children put in their care. The sisters also cooked, cleaned, taught school, did laundry, cared for the children and the chapel, and that was 24-hour duty 7 days a week. So I asked one of the sisters, I did go to St. Walburg Monastery and did some research. The sisters have a wonderful collection of original material, so I was able to look at letters, I was able to look at primary resources that go back to the Articles of Incorporation in the 1840s of this society. So they do have those records on file. This is one of the photographs they gave to me of 2 of the sisters who were teaching there. Now, just to give you an idea, this was their common garment that they wore throughout the year. The white coif that you see here is actually pleats. So it's a pleated it's a pleated piece of garment that's starch. And so if you would look at it up close, it looks like an accordion, and it's hanging here. And the sisters would say if you had hard duty throughout the day, you would sweat, obviously. You can imagine wearing that in August in 98 degrees and humidity. And as the day went on, the coif got longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. But the young sisters were given the task every morning of getting up early and making those garments every day for all the sisters to start the day. So, yes. The St. John congregation eventually evolved into Blessed Sacrament Parish. So if you're ever looking for records for Blessed Sacrament or for people living in that general area genealogy-wise, Blessed Sacrament does not start till 1920. Previous to that time, most of the people in that area went to the St. John Orphanage Chapel. And there are records for baptisms, marriages, and deaths. And so St. John congregation was the official parish for the Fort Mitchell area until 1920. The orphanage grew slowly. By 1923, they had, on their 75th anniversary, they had a special Mass in Mother of God. There were 50 children in residence at the time. 1926, they had a major fire, and we'll see lots of orphanages have fires. It seems to be a common theme throughout this time period. I'm not sure if the kids were having fun or if people were watching, but fires seem to be a consistent theme throughout orphan asylum history. By 1929, there were 104 children in residence, and there would have been 12 nuns at that time taking care of the 109 orphans. So you can imagine, and that's 24 hours a day, so they were working in 3 8-hour shifts. So that's a lot to do. And again, we talked about they're not always orphans. A lot of times when I've talked to people who were raised at these orphanages, many of them were, their mother had passed away, maybe during childbirth, from an illness. The father had to work. During this time period, there are no daycares. There are no nursery schools. If you did not have local family who could take the child in, there was really nowhere for that child to go. And so many times there were weekday orphans. So the children would go to school Monday through Friday and would live at the orphanage Monday through Friday. The father would pick them up Friday after school, have them at home Saturday and Sunday, and then they would return to the orphanage on Monday. This practice sometimes lasted a year or two. Sometimes it lasted until the children turned 16 or 18 and went out into society. What usually made the difference for the children coming home? Any guesses? What would happen in the family that would allow the children to come home? The husband remarries. Almost immediately, if the husband remarries, the children are removed from the orphan asylum and they're returned to their family. They had another fire in 1935, and the headline I thought was interesting: loss may reach 35,000 in fire at St. John Orphanage Chapel. Children die now after watching fire. And if you read the article, the children actually, everybody got out of the building safely. The sisters got everybody out. The men who were working the farm tried to put the fire out. They called the local fire department, which was what? Covington at this point. So by the time the fire department got to the orphan asylum, you can imagine there was really not much left. So the orphans, the neighbors in the community actually brought food, set up under the trees, blankets, brought blankets, set up under the trees, a dinner, and then they farmed the children out, so to speak, to the neighboring children until they could find a permanent house for them until they could rebuild. So the orphans lived with local families for a few days and then were eventually sent to other orphanages, mostly St. Joseph and St. Aloysius and St. Joseph. Those are two are in Cincinnati, and St. Joseph in Campbell County. They did return once the repairs were made. Towards the end, Sister Lillian Goki was the superior of the orphanage in the 1950s. She saw a shift from true orphans to children with other issues. So by the 1950s, they're starting to see children entering the orphanage that had emotional issues, that had psychological issues, that had learning disabilities that were not diagnosed during that time as learning disabilities, who had issues that today that would be we would recognize and be able to treat. In those days, they didn't have the awareness, and so she wanted to shift the work of the orphanage more towards a modern children's home. And so she was looking at bringing in social workers to work with the children. She was talking about specialized care. She was talking about small family units. So she wanted to build a new building that would have families, so that the orphanage was divided into families. The Board of Trustees, who had been almost entirely men during the entire 100 and so years of existence, did not particularly like the idea. They did not like change. They wanted things the way they had been. And so they fought the sisters in particular on this movement. The sisters, we often think of women religious as having no real power in the church. I will inform you that that is not true. They had one trump card that no one could beat. What is that trump card? We're gone. And so the Benedictine sisters, if you look at their letters to the bishop in the 1950s, they're starting to say the Board of Trustees is not moving forward, they're not moving with the times, we need to update, we need to offer these children better care. The bishop was writing back and saying, okay, let's see what we can do, and the sisters would write back and say the same thing again, and finally the sister said, if there is not a change, we will be leaving. So during this time period, as the sisters are trying to get things worked out with the bishop and with the Board of Trustees in particular, the name of the orphanage is changed to the St. John's Children's Home in 1957. So the board took that step, but they really would not take any more of the suggestions that the sisters were asking for. And so in 1957, the sisters left. They basically said, okay, we've been here 100 years, but it's time to go. The bishop called up the Sisters of Notre Dame and said, okay, will you take on this orphanage? They were running St. Joseph Orphanage in Cold Spring, which we'll talk about in a minute. They said, that's fine, but we're going to merge the two. If we take this over, we're not going to run two orphanages. We're only going to do one. And so the bishop and the boards went back and forth and went back and forth and went back and forth, and the sisters just finally made an ultimatum, the Sisters of Notre Dame, and said, okay, 1 year, and you agree to it, and we'll move on. So that's what happened. So 1957, the Benedictines leave, the Sisters of Notre Dame take over. 1961, the property is turned over to the diocese. Up until that time period, the property had been owned by the Orphan Society, not the diocese. And in 1961, St. John's Children's Home and St. Joseph's Children's Home in Cold Spring are merged in Fort Mitchell to form what we know today as the Diocesan Catholic Children's Home. Now, if you go to the Diocesan Catholic Children's Home today, you will see social workers working there. You will see therapeutic treatment being offered there. You will see special education teachers working there. You will see the teachers the students living in small family groups with house parents. Exactly what the sister was asking for in 1951. So it turned out the sisters, of course, knew better than the Board of Trustees because they were working day to day with the children, so they knew what the children needed. We have St. Joseph Orphanage in Cold Spring. So the Campbell County Catholics, and if you look at Catholic history in Northern Kentucky, there is this huge rivalry between Catholics in Campbell and Kenton County. It's just true. There's this raging thing about, how many parishes are in each county, how many schools are in each county, who has how many high schools, where does the bishop live? And it came to the point where the bishop decided that the cathedral was in Covington, so Bishop Malloy decided he was going to live in Newport just to calm people down. Because they were the two biggest counties in the diocese, And that's where most of the Catholics lived, and so that's how he kind of dealt with it. So the Campbell County German Catholics in 1866 formed the St. Boniface Orphan Society. All Catholics in Newport, Dayton, and actually Bellevue, I should put on there, were encouraged to join. What's missing on that list? Newport, Bellevue, Dayton. The suburbs. You know why? Nobody lived there. It was a farming community. It was not a very Catholic part of the county. So it's very interesting if you look at the Catholic population in northern Kentucky and how it has quickly, after World War II, shifted dramatically from the river cities south. In 1870, the Walsh Farm in Cold Spring is acquired for a site for an orphanage. Anybody know what the Walsh family did for a living? How they made their fortune? Well-known Newport family, they were distillers. They made whiskey. And they also distributed whiskey. The facade on the cathedral was built in 1910. The bishop had run out of money in the 1890s. The Walsh family donated $100,000, and that's why the facade on the cathedral is there today. So it's the same Walsh family. So they donated the property to start the orphanage in Cold Spring. It was on Newport and Alexandria Pike. Bishop Tebby, who has a very unusual middle name, I always think, Maria. I think even in the 1840s that kid had to have been made fun of. Anyway, he started the orphan asylum in both counties, basically. He's known in the diocese as the orphan bishop. He started a number of orphan asylums throughout the Diocese of Covington. The orphanage opened either in 1870 or 1869. The records are not clear. The Notre Dame nuns ran St. Joseph Orphanage, and they also have a wonderful collection of materials, and I looked at a lot of their primary resources. Even their materials are contradictory. I have a feeling what happened is in 1869, they did the official paperwork, and in 1870, the building actually opened, but I can't prove that. This is, by the way, a painting. The diocese had paintings of the first 6 bishops of Covington. This is a painting of Bishop Tebby from Leon, done by Leon Lippert. Dr. Ted Cotty talked this morning about German artists in northern Kentucky. Leon Lippert was kind of the next generation. Did a lot of church work, did a lot of portraiture work throughout the country, particularly in greater Cincinnati. So here's the sign. Here's the Alexandria Pike. The green section in the middle is the current St. Joseph Church orphanage. So if you're familiar with St. Joseph Church in Cold Spring, that's their cemetery. If you see where I have my little red dot there, that's the Disabled American Veterans Building. Does everybody know where that is on the Alexandria Pike? That is the site of the St. Joseph Orphanage. So when we're talking about St. Joseph Orphanage, that's where it was located. When they closed and merged with St. John to form the Diocesan Catholic Children's Home, the property was sold to the Veterans Administration. So that building is on that property. It was put under the directions of the Brothers of the Poor of St. Francis, who came to Cincinnati from Germany in 1866. Can anybody read that first cover of the Constitution? If you can read German script. The Constitution, the original Constitution of the Association, is written in German and the original German script. So you'll see that just like with St. John Orphanage, these are German Catholics for the most part who are establishing this institution. The Brothers of the Poor of St. Francis also had a home for many years in can't remember the name, in Cincinnati, one of the suburbs in Cincinnati, and it was a home for troubled boys, and they also had an industrial school attached to it for many years. They're still active. There's a small group of them. Yes, thank you. There's still a small group of brothers in Covington that are still active in Covington. So the number of boys increased dramatically. Originally, St. Joseph was open only to boys, and then later it was open to both, so boys and girls. June 21, 1871, a new orphanage is dedicated at the cost of $15,000. So you can imagine $15,000 to build an entire orphanage. They come into some issues here though, because again, the trustees didn't quite do their homework. They paid the contractor, but they did not have in the contract that the contractor had to pay the subcontractors. So the contractor left with the $15,000, the subcontractors did not get paid. This is a problem if you're a subcontractor. So the brothers were really working very hard to try to get the mortgage down. They were trying to pay off the debt that they owed the subcontractors, and they were paying them off a little bit at a time, trying to, get the creditors away until they could finally get rid of the entire debt. And eventually the property is bought back by the St. Boniface Orphanage Society. So the brothers turned it back to them, and the brothers, they leave. So they've had enough of St. Joseph Orphan Society, they've had enough of the Board of Trustees, and they leave, which leaves Bishop Tebby in a bit of a pickle. He needs someone to take over the orphanage. And so he turns to the Sisters of Notre Dame, who had arrived in Covington the year before. The Sisters of Notre Dame had come from Germany during the Kulturkampf, which basically was trying to make Germany a Protestant state, and there was lots of restrictions against nuns during that time period and religious in general. And so almost every Sister of Notre Dame left Germany in about a 5-year period and came to Cleveland and Covington. And so a group of them came to Covington. Fortunately, Bishop Tebby's blood sister, Sister Modesta Tebby, was amongst them. And when her brother came and said, "We need help at the orphanage," she said yes. So the Sisters of Notre Dame came and took over the operation of the orphanage. And that was in 1877. So the St. Boniface Orphan Society assumed obligation to provide each sister with housing and food and to pay them a salary of $50 a year. So the sisters weren't in this for the money, let's put it that way. At the bottom here is the third from the left is Sister, she's St. Julie Billiard now, who is the founder of or at least the founders of the Sisters of Notre Dame, or the spiritual founders of the Sisters of Notre Dame. In 1879, the creditors gave the sisters 24 hours to pay off their debt of $3,000. And so there's a letter in the archives requesting that the money be paid, and you have 24 hours to pay it. There was a priest in Newport named Father Mershman who said, okay, we can't let this happen, we've got to get this debt done. He goes door to door in Newport and begs. He comes back, sister asks him, the sister superior says, do we have to close? His response is written in the annals of the sisters. And his response was, "Sister, I have all the money in my pocket." He was able to raise $3,000 in one day, going door to door in Newport in the 1870s and begging. He was able to save the orphanage. He turned the money over. The Walsh family was another great help of keeping the orphanage afloat during these early days. And again, the Sisters of Notre Dame struggled during this time period too, trying to make it ends meet and pay the bills. There were fires in 1884 and 1888. Again, fires. 1885, the girls began to be accepted so families could be kept together. And the same thing happened at St. John Orphanage. And you'll see lots of time with orphanages, they tended to separate groups by gender. What they did at St. John's and St. Joseph was to build separate dormitories. So the sisters still had charge of both sets of dormitories, but the children were still separated by gender, but still had contact with each other as a family unit to some degree. So they were at least able, even though they weren't able to live with their parents, at least they could see their brothers and sisters if they were of different genders. This is a picture on the left of the main building, and you can see it from the side here. So you can see it's been added on to over the years many, many times. The front here with the steeple is the front that you're seeing there from the opposite direction. And you'll see it's very close to Alexandria Pike, is right in front. And that is basically the orphanage that exists until it is torn down in 1961. So you can see in 1961, when they merged the two, there was not only a need to do so for the sake of facilities, or for the sake of the sisters combining their efforts into one institution, but they also needed more modern facilities, obviously, than this in 1961. Here's some interior shots of St. Joseph Orphanage. So there's girls, what are they learning? Ironing. What are they doing in the bottom? Attending school. Looks like a fairly typical classroom that you would have probably seen in any school during that time period. So the sisters at both institutions, and you'll see this when we get to the Protestant orphanages, tried to make the orphan asylums, the orphanages, as homey as they could. And so you'll see they tried to bring some normalcy to what was going on. The interesting thing with a lot of these pictures with both of the Catholic orphanages, you rarely see the sisters in the photos. And sister in the front row can't answer that question, but why do you think why do you think you don't see too many photos of sisters in these photos? Anybody know? Typically, unless they had permission from their superior, they were not allowed to have their pictures taken. It was humility. You know, you were to be humble, and that was a show of pride. And so I had a great aunt who was a sister of Notre Dame. We have a picture of her, one picture of her as a postulant, one picture of her at her 25th anniversary, and one picture of her at her 50th anniversary, and nothing in between. You rarely see those photographs unless it was done for an official reason. And a lot of times, even in their works, when they wrote books and things, it will say, written by a sister of Notre Dame, not by the sister's name. And so the sisters, fortunately, in tradition, know who actually did the work and have corrected some of those things that we have unfortunately omitted. Here's a picture of the orphans in the 1930s. I thought this was an interesting quote. In 1940, it said in the annals, Marie DeMarcus and George Borchers, former children of the home, asked the privilege of having their marriage solemnized in the orphan chapel. So this was a male orphan and a female orphan who were raised in the orphan asylum, and when they got married, they decided to get married at the chapel. And so when I talk to different people who were raised in the orphanages, either the Protestant or Catholic orphanages, it's interesting because some of them have very bad experiences, and they were separated from their parents. They just did not adjust well, and some of them have very good memories of the time that they were there. Even though they were separated from their families, they felt connected and cared for, and so it's interesting the differences the children faced. By 1961, the year St. Joseph closed, there are 12 sisters on staff, one lay teacher who was teaching needlework, one farm manager, one farm hand, one maintenance man, and a social worker. So the Sisters of Notre Dame were doing the same thing that the Benedictines wanted to do, was to get a more modern facility taking care of the children that needed the care. The needlework teacher was Margaret Maggie Gerhardt. She had lived at St. Joseph Orphanage for 75 years and was 83 years old. So she had been raised there most of her life as an orphan and stayed on afterwards and taught the next 2 or 3 generations of children at St. Joseph. When the orphan asylum was merged with St. John to become the Diocesan Catholic Children's Home, she was sent to St. Charles, which was a nursing home run by the Sisters of Notre Dame. So the Sisters of Notre Dame made sure they took care of her, and she lived in St. Charles until she died. There were 42 in residence at that time, 26 boys and 16 girls. And as I said, in 1961, the 2 institutions were merged. A new building was built in Fort Mitchell. The Sisters of Notre Dame took charge of it and still are in charge of it to this day. And so a lot of those changes that the Benedictine sister, as I said, wanted actually did occur. A couple short-lived ones really quickly. The Sisters of the Good Shepherd in Fort Thomas had a small orphanage for a time period. If you're familiar with the Fort Thomas branch of the library, the Sisters of the Good Shepherd are still next door to that property. They had a small orphanage there for a while. They moved very quickly. The Sisters of the Good Shepherd, one of their charisms, or one of the things that they really work towards, is working with young women. And they moved very quickly to working with young women who had issues. And they could be family issues, they could be educational issues. Many of them, especially in the early time period, were unwed mothers. And so they focused more on those issues than on a traditional orphanage. St. Elizabeth Hospital, right after the Civil War, started a small orphanage that lasted for about 10 to 15 years. It was basically done because there were so many young men that had been killed in the war, and women were left, and the women who were left often had to work or find some way of maintaining some sort of income, and so the children had to be cared for. And so the sisters took them in. Yes?
Is that where Belle Breeze's daughter went until she was
Yes.
18?
Yes. So the orphanage didn't last too long, but one of the things that I find fascinating about the orphanage, this is the orphans right after the Civil War. This is the late 1860s. What do you notice in this picture that would be unusual to you in the 1860s in an orphan asylum?
People of color.
They're actually African Americans. The Sisters of the Poor of St. Francis, remember we talked the Brothers of the Poor of St. Francis? This is the male half of that order. The Sisters of the Poor of St. Francis. They established St. Elizabeth Hospital and operated it up until the 1960s. They ran the orphan asylum. They were German immigrants. Germans had a long tradition of being anti-slavery, actually aboard slavery, and many of the German immigrants who came to this area also had a very strong view of being anti-slavery. And when the nuns started taking in orphans, they did not make a distinction. We are very lucky at the Kent County Library, right before, you know, all those HIPAA forms you have to fill out every time you go to the doctor, they kill you. Right before that HIPAA legislation was passed, sorry, I'm checking my time. Right before the HIPAA legislation was passed, the record keeper at St. Elizabeth came to us at the library and said, we have all the admissions books going back to the opening of the hospital, and we want to do something with them before HIPAA passes. What do you think? So we took them. We have all the original ones going up to the 1940s. Most of them have been indexed. They're still working on them. But the early records have been indexed. From the very beginning, the hospital took in people of all religions and all races. So you'll see African American patients being admitted in the 1860s. So the sisters had a very liberal, progressive opinion of dealing with people of different race, especially in the 1860s. All right. Either I'm running out of battery, which I think I am. Yep. Could you help me, Elaine? Just hit the space bar. Don't hit the update. Maybe that's what it's doing for.
Try St. Francis.
That was it. Okay. We have the Protestants are also getting into the game. During this time period, we have a progressive movement in this country. We're starting to look at the poor in a different way. There's this progressive movement that's starting to see that the poor aren't poor simply because they're lazy. That we need to start looking at the poor in a different way. And there's this large progressive movement that's moving through the country looking at different aspects of poverty and how we address poverty. And so you'll see lots of orphanages coming up during this time period. The Protestants of Covington got together in 1880. A group of well-connected businessmen met to discuss a Protestant orphanage in Covington. In 1881, a permanent board of trustees is established with Amos Schenkel as the president. Anybody know what Amos Schenkel is most remembered for in Northern Kentucky? He raised money for a particular structure that's 150 years old today.
A bridge.
Yes. He was the major financier behind the suspension bridge. Again, we're tying perfectly into the whole theme of today. Schenkel was from Broward County, Ohio. He came to Northern Kentucky as worked on a boat. He ended up buying a boat and then ended up owning a fleet of boats that hauled coal from Pittsburgh all the way down to Cairo, Illinois. Yes?
Didn't he build the Opera House up on Madison too?
Yes, he built, yes. The other thing that he did was he invested heavily in real estate. And so he was, when he died in 1892 or 1893, the wealthiest man in Covington. He was worth over $1 million in 1890s money. He also was, I always say he was a late convert to Methodism, but I always say he was the convert to Methodism. We have the records of the First Methodist Church behind us in Covington. When they closed, they gave us their records. And so we have the baptismal record of him and his wife Sarah. And it clearly states that they were sprinkled and not dunked, which I thought was interesting. They made that comment. But they both became converts late in life. But what he ended up doing with his fortune was giving it away. And I think of him as Andrew Carnegie of Northern Kentucky for Methodists. What he would do is, if a group of the Methodists in Northern Kentucky wanted to start a congregation, he would say, give me plans and how much it's going to cost to build the building. You raise half the money, I will give you the other half. So we have documentation of about a dozen Methodist churches throughout Northern Kentucky, from Ludlow in the west to Dayton in the east, across the urban core, that he paid half of the construction of that Baptist church building. So when I say he was the Methodist in Northern Kentucky, I mean he was the Methodist in Northern Kentucky. And so he got the businessmen together in Covington and also the ministers together in Covington and formed an organization. He also left an endowment. The endowment still exists. So when you think about, leaving money in the 1880s as an endowment, and you think it's still there and still being used. So that the Covington Protestant Children's Home was established in 1881. This is a record, so you'll see it's George W. Baldwin. He date of birth was July 10, 1883. And look where he's place of birth. Can anybody read that? There.
Covington Protestant Children's Home.
I don't understand. There we go. Right here. It says Pendleton County. So if you're looking, it's very interesting when we got these records. They're drawing from a very broad, there were no other orphanages in Northern Kentucky but those two Catholic ones. So you can imagine Protestant families wanted their child in a Protestant orphanage if that was possible. And so you're seeing all of these people from surrounding counties also sending their children to the Covington Protestant Children's Home. So the records are amazing. The director of the Children's Home, Rick Worth, came to the library, Elaine, a couple years ago, and talked to us about their records. They wanted to preserve them. We agreed to take them, Elaine agreed to take them, and Elaine and her staff do what they always do, which is very diligently scan them, index them, and make them online. So this record's online. There are a lot of these early records of the orphans at the Covington Protestant Children's Home online. So if you're interested and you had a family member there, you will find lots of information. It tells you the father's name, the mother's name, where the father and mother were born. So the father's from Pendleton, the mother was born in Covington, or living in Covington, which could be the reason why he is in the Covington Protestant Children's Home. The father and the mother are living in two different places. Farmer, seamstress, Methodist, tells you their ancestry. So it gives you lots of information there. There it is, cause of admission, father is deceased, mother is sick. So technically this child is not a true orphan. His mother is alive, but his mother cannot take care of him. So that's why he's in the orphanage. So lots of hints in this record. If this child had been adopted, and we don't know that, but if he had been adopted, this could be a wonderful piece of information if you can tie this into that person.
So the term, 6 months, is
Yes.
that how long he was there, or that's how long he can be there?
The parents typically said permanent or gave a term, and the term could be extended depending on the family's condition. But in this case, it probably meant that that the mother did not expect them to be put into the orphanage permanently. Yes?
So in your research, do you feel that the Protestants started to organize and, come together for something like this in terms of like a competition with the Catholics? Or
Yes.
was it, okay.
There is no doubt.
Okay.
And when Dr. Tenkani talked about the different churches being built in northern Kentucky and how they were competing with the buildings of who could build the best and who could build the nicest building, well, the institutions, they were doing the same things with institutions. And I think that's really hard for us to understand today because we don't live in this hyper-religious society that many of these folks did live in. Religion had a very day-to-day impact on your life. And so the rivalry between groups was much stronger than it is today. Today we see that as kind of like ridiculous. Why would you, let's get together and make this happen kind of thing. Yes?
It's probably the same today as Christians and Muslims.
Well, the differences, yes, the differences are less understood. People have less contact with one another, and that was certainly true amongst Protestants and Catholics during this time period. So yes, there was definite competition. And it's interesting that in some of the records, there's baptisms going on in the different congregations across the different Protestant and the Catholic children's homes of children as they're admitted. Because, one believed that they were not baptized Catholic, they were going to hell. One believed that they were not baptized Protestant, they were going to hell. So, baptize them. So, many of these kids were baptized twice. So they're Catholic? I don't know. Come up with a nice combination of the two. So the board decided on an urban location, which was unusual. The other two picked rural sites. The Covington Protestant Children's Home picked an urban site. They did choose Samuel Hannaford. We keep having these connections. Samuel Hannaford was one of the preeminent architects of his time. He built a 3.5-story building on Madison Avenue. He had a chapel and 40 rooms, or rooms for 40 orphans. The article that's in the newspaper during this time period describes the home in great detail. And it even talks about the writer of the newspaper article was just fascinated with the small tables and chairs. Because the Board of Trustees decided to buy tables and chairs that actually fit children. Which in 1881 was this kind of like, what? Why would you have a table that's only this tall? But the writer, the newspaper writer, just thought this was fascinating and waxed on and on about the furnishings. The building and the construction was $53,000, and Schinkel paid for it all. So he wrote a check, so to speak. They had a board of 36 women supervisors, and they ran the day-to-day operations. They also had a board of trustees, which was all male. So again, we're seeing this dichotomy on both sides of the spectrum here of the women run it, the men are calling the shots behind the scenes, or think they're calling the shots behind the scenes. 1887, he starts his endowment, which is still there. This is the Covington Protestant Children's Home.
Attention, History Day participants. In about 10 minutes, your programs are going to be done. And the raffle will be announced in the main area by the table. So come there to check and claim your raffle prizes.
That's my 10-minute warning. So this is the Covington Protestant Children's Home. Stood on Madison Avenue. The home was very successful, supported by an endowment and periodic donations from the area congregations. They accepted children up to 16 years of age. What happened when you turned 16?
You went to work.
You were on your own. I mean, think about that. Totally different world. In the years following World War II, things began to change. This is a Sanborn insurance map of the original building. So you'll see, this is Madison Avenue here, running right here, and there's 14th and 15th is down here. So that is the site. What is this running on the other side, these lines on the other side? Anybody know? That's the railroad. What they did not know when they were building this facility was that the railroad was expanding. The roundhouse is built later. It becomes a really not a good place for children. And so what happens with the Covington Protestant Children's Home is, in 1924, they buy 25 acres near DeVue Park. So they buy a new plot of land adjacent to DeVue Park. Samuel Hanford and Sons is commissioned to design a new facility. Cost $285,000, which opened in December 1926. The Schinkel family, by the way, Amos was long gone by then, but his grandson donated to the fund. There is the second Covington Protestant Children's Home. It's on the ridge of overlooking the Ohio River. This is the original path down to the overlook. So if you're familiar where the Behringer Crawford Museum is, right behind it is what was originally the Covington Protestant Children's Home. Eventually the nursery department is closed, and the age of admittance is boys from age 16 to 18. As we come later in this time period, the Protestant Children's Home is experiencing the same thing as the Catholic ones were. They're not having as many orphans, they're not having as much need for that. And so they're changing the way they're working as well, doing similar things, hiring social workers, doing special education, and all of those things that normally would be done. In 1969, the first African American resident was admitted. Think about that, 1969. I was alive. I mean, think about it.
I was 10 years old.
1990, the name was officially changed to the Children's Home of Northern Kentucky. So if you're looking for the Covington Protestant Children's Home today, it's the Children's Home of Northern Kentucky. It becomes a non-denominational institution and is relying, as the diocese, the Catholic Children's Home. There's much more federal and state funding available than there was, and the Covington Protestant Children's Home changed their name as the Catholic Children's Homes did as well. There was also a Campbell County Protestant Orphanage. They were in competition with Covington. Remember we talked about the Catholics in competition? Protestants were doing the same thing. Kent and Campbell. Can't we just get along? So in 1884, the Protestant congregations began to drive to purchase land and to build an orphanage. They buy the George Fearon home, which was purchased in 1886 for $1,200. That's the house. Can you imagine buying that for $1,200? And it becomes the Campbell County Protestant Children's Home. And this remains the building throughout the time period. So this is the home, it's not added onto, it's not redeveloped on the site. If you're wondering where it's located, this is 15th Street in Newport, so it's down in the Clifton area. Anybody know what's on the site now?
Baptist Home.
The Baptist Home. So if you're looking, that used to be called the Baptist Convalescent Center. That's the site of the original Campbell County Protestant Children's Home. It was originally called the Campbell County Protestant Orphanage. As the building aged and the cost to make repairs, they started looking at perhaps that wasn't the best location. There started to be issues with the building and not meeting code, which I'm sure the Catholic ones were facing as well because of the age of the building. In the 1940s, they look at the Highland Nursery site, which is purchased. It was a 25-acre piece of property on the Alexander Pike and Cold Spring, and they built a new building, which you'll see at the bottom there. Once at the new location in 1952, the Campbell County Protestant Orphanage becomes known as Holly Hill. So everybody know where I've heard of Holly Hill? That originally was the Campbell County Protestant Children's Home. So all of these institutions still exist in one way, shape, or form, but not by their original names. So if you're doing the genealogy of orphanages, you gotta know the maiden name, so to speak, of the orphanage. Like the other homes in the area, they were looking more toward moving away more from housing orphans because there really weren't orphans, so to speak of, or not many, and we're moving more towards children with developmental issues, children with special needs. And so Holly Hill and the Covington Protestant Children's Home went through the same transformations. And so you'll see these institutions evolving from true orphanages to special care for children, or homes for children who need special care. Holly Hill moved to its current site in 1990. So, I'm going to finish, which I think there's some irony in this photograph, for two reasons. First of all, this is the women's auxiliary officers at Holly Hill. This was the Holly Hill Ball. So all of these orphanages had their little ways of raising money. I know the Catholic orphanages had dinners, so they would have like a festival. The Protestant orphanage in Covington had a festival for a number of years, but because they were serving alcohol at it, they finally stopped because half the members liked the alcohol and half the members didn't like the alcohol. So again, all kinds of cultural issues going on here. But anyway, I think this photograph is interesting. First of all, again, the driving force behind most of these institutions, the ones who actually took care of the children, the ones who pushed for the innovations, the ones who actually kind of made things happen were the women. And so I think it's important that we recognize Protestant, Catholic, it was the women who had the soft spot for the orphans, who made sure these children were being taken care of, and made sure as societal needs changed, the orphanages changed with them. Now, what's ironic about this photograph? It's from the Kentucky Post, and it's from, I think, probably the 1960s, I would guess. The information about the photograph was from the back of the photo. What is ironic about the photograph's information?
The women don't have a name.
The women do not have a name. And when I put this up, I just chose this photograph as a random photo of women who did the work. And I gave it to a staff member and I said, could you please proofread this for me? And she got to the last page and she started laughing and I said, what? She said, the women don't have names. I said, no, they're by their husband's name. And so you'll see how things have evolved over the years. My mother, until she was probably in her 70s, always signed her name as Mrs. Edward F. Schroeder. And finally my sister and I said, Mom, you have an identity beyond Dad. You can sign checks as Mary Lou Schroeder. And she said, oh. And from that day forward, she always signed her checks as Mary Lou Schroeder, which I thought fascinating. But it had never dawned on her because that was what was socially acceptable for her generation. And so I'm ending with the story of women because I think in this story of these institutions, it was really the women who made things happen. So questions before they interrupt us and announce we want to make sure we won if we won. Yes?
Earlier you were saying about the one Catholic home that they had about 104 children.
Yes.
Was that a lot? I mean, what was their
Yes.
capacity?
The most I've seen in any of the four that we've talked about was about 125.
Oh, wow.
Yes. I have not seen numbers higher than that. Yes?
Are there lists of names, say for example from St. Joseph's and St. John's from the 1800s?
There are some from the early 1900s. The 1800s are extremely sketchy. They're all at the Diocesan Catholic Children's Home. So if they exist, that's where they are. Yes.
Can you get records of, from the Catholic Diocese adoption agencies? Are all those records closed?
all of those records are closed up until about 30 years ago when they started doing open adoptions. So the church is pretty much bound. It was done through Catholic Social Services. So Catholic Social Services is bound to those laws when those adoptions were made. So legally, they can't be released. I will give you all a good piece of information. If you're looking for an adoption in Kentucky, what Kentucky did was issue two birth certificates. So there's one under the original child's name, or his mother's name, and then there's one by the adopted family's name. And they use the same birth date, but they're totally separate piece documents. So if you're really interested in trying to find an adoption, one thing that we discovered just by accident at the library, I don't know, it was before I started, so it's been at least 25 years ago, the health department published books every year on birth certificates, and we have the whole set for Kenton County that exists, as far as I know. They start in 1911 and go up through the late 60s. And they have an index of all the births in Kentucky for that year. So what you can do, if you know you have an orphan and you don't know, or you have an adoptee and you don't know their original name, you can go to those books. You have to go through the whole book, but look for children with that birth date. And you can obviously get rid of half of them because they're either male or female. And then if you know the county they're in, you can really narrow these things down. So we have had people who have come, and I know I've worked with them, who said, I know they were born in Robertson County on this date, and it was a male. So you go through, you look for all the Robertson County births on that date who are male. Robertson County has 3,000 people in it. There were 2 births on this one occasion on that day. 1 male, 1 female. We hit it. We found the adoption that easy. The state figured out that you could do this and asked for those books back. And some counties gave them back. Kenton County said, they approached Kenton County Library and said, no, we think we'll keep them. And nobody ever said anything more, and so we just kind of kept them. So those books do exist and can be extremely helpful if you know enough information. And even in a large county like Kenton, and there's maybe 12 births that day, you know, you take out 6 for the other gender, it at least gives you a name of 6 to work from. So it can be very helpful. Sometimes it doesn't work at all, just because of the record keeping. But again, that duplication of 2 birth certificates in a weird sort of way helped out adoptees. It wasn't meant to be that way, but that's how it's worked. Other questions? Get out your red tickets. Thank you all.